She traded her Bible for a bag of cocaine and her prayer bonnet for a loaded gun. In just 30 days, Elizabeth went from a silent farmhouse to ruling the violent streets of Philadelphia alongside a drug lord. But as she sits in a car filled with illicit cargo, staring down the barrel of a police squad, she's about to realize that the devil doesn't come with horns. He comes with a smile and a gold chain, and he just sold her soul for a discount. The morning air in Lancaster County always tasted the same, a heavy mixture of damp earth and manure that seemed to have soaked into the very skin of the generations who lived here. The mist had not yet lifted from the fields as I stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards groaning softly under my boots. Inside the farmhouse, an absolute, ringing silence reigned, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting away seconds that felt identical to the ones from 100 years ago. My travel bag, simple and worn from years of use by my sisters before me, sat at my feet, containing the few plain garments I was permitted to take into the world. Jacob was already waiting by the buggy, his silhouette cutting a sharp figure against the gray morning light. The horse snorted, its breath pluming in the chill air, but Jacob stood as still as a statue. His face, framed by a pale blonde beard that he had been growing with such pride, held a mixture of stiff dignity and underlying anxiety. He was dependable, solid as the oak table in our kitchen, and unfortunately, just as predictable in every way. When he saw me, he offered a small, tight nod, not stepping forward to embrace me, for we were in public view, even if the only witness was the silent barn and the watching crows on the fence line. He extended his hand to help me climb up, and his palm felt rough and warm against my own, a sensation of calloused skin that I had known my entire life. As the buggy lurched forward, rolling down the gravel driveway, the familiar rhythm of the hooves began to beat a tattoo against the road. For the entire duration of the drive to the bus station, Jacob filled the silence with talk of the future, his voice a steady drone that seemed to vibrate in the wooden frame of the carriage. He spoke of the addition we would build onto the main house after my return, describing the timber he had already selected and the placement of the windows. I nodded at the appropriate intervals, adjusting the strings of my prayer covering, which effectively hid the heavy knot of hair pinned at the back of my neck. He spoke of this month in the outside world not as an adventure, but as a necessary trial, a crucible that would merely harden the iron of my faith. In his mind, there was no question of the outcome. I would see the sin and the chaos of the English world, be repulsed by it, and return running to the safety of the community and to him. He did not see the way my fingers picked at the hem of my apron, or the way my eyes were already scanning the horizon, looking for something sharp enough to cut these invisible cords. When we finally arrived at the station, the contrast was immediate and violent. The smell of diesel fumes assaulted my nose, replacing the scent of wet hay, and the rumble of idling engines drowned out the clip-clop of the horse. Jacob climbed down first, securing the reins, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to slow down time itself. He retrieved my bag and turned to face me, his blue eyes searching mine for a reassurance I was struggling to manufacture. From his pocket, he produced a small object wrapped in a piece of cloth, pressing it into my hands with a solemnity that made the air between us feel heavy and thick. I unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small wooden bird, carved from a piece of light maple, smooth and sanded to perfection. It was a symbol of our promise, he told me, a reminder that like the birds of the air, I might fly for a season, but I would always know where my nest was. I looked at the delicate curve of the wings, knowing how many hours he must have spent whittling it by lantern light, thinking of me with every slice of the knife. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but as I held it, it felt less like a gift and more like a shackle, a physical weight binding me to the soil I was so desperate to leave behind. I climbed the metal steps of the bus, the rubber treads foreign beneath my soles, and selected a seat by the window. The engine roared to life, a mechanical beast coughing out clouds of black smoke that looked utterly alien against the pristine rural sky. Through the glass, which was streaked with grime, I watched Jacob standing on the platform. He raised his hand in a stiff wave, his figure growing smaller and smaller as the bus pulled away, until he was nothing more than a dark smudge against the backdrop of the rolling green hills. I did not wave back, only stared until the distance swallowed him whole. Alone now, surrounded by strangers and the hum of the highway, I looked down at the wooden bird resting in my lap. I traced the smooth lines, feeling the warmth of the wood that still held the heat of his hands, the suffocating tenderness of his devotion. A sudden, cold clarity washed over me, sharper than the winter wind. Slowly, deliberately, I closed my hand around the carving. I squeezed, applying pressure until my knuckles turned white, channeling every ounce of my stifled frustration into that grip. I wanted to see if the cage would break, if the predictability could be shattered by a single act of will. The sound was sudden and satisfying, a dry, sharp crack that signaled the splintering of the wood. I opened my hand to see the bird broken in two, the jagged edges of the maple exposing the raw grain inside. With a look of cold indifference, I brushed the debris off my lap, letting the broken pieces fall onto the dirty, gum-stained floor of the bus. I did not feel guilt, nor did I feel sadness. Instead, as the bus accelerated toward the highway, leaving the silence of Lancaster behind, I felt a dark, intoxicating anticipation blooming in my chest, warm and dangerous, like the first sip of forbidden wine. Philadelphia crashed into me with the violence of a thunderstorm, a cacophony of sounds that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. I stepped off the bus and was immediately assaulted by a wall of noise that made my ears ring, a constant, grinding roar that never seemed to take a breath. It was the sound of a million engines, a million voices, and the screech of metal on metal, all woven together into a tapestry of chaos. In the quiet fields of home, a single hawk's cry could command the sky, but here, even a scream would be swallowed whole by the indifference of the city. I clutched the handle of my bag until my fingers ached, feeling the vibrations of the concrete platform travel up through the soles of my sensible black shoes, shaking the stillness out of me. There was no horizon here, no comforting line where the earth met the heavens to tell you where the world ended and God began. Instead, there were only gray walls, colossal monoliths of stone and glass that stretched upward, clawing at the sky and choking out the light. I tilted my head back, my neck straining, trying to find a patch of blue, but the buildings were like the bars of a cage, locking me in a canyon of man-made ambition. The air was different, too. It lacked the scent of rain and growing things, replaced by a heavy, metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. It felt as though the city had built a lid over itself, trapping the exhaust and the noise inside with us, creating a pressure cooker that was slowly building toward an explosion. I looked down at the ground, seeking something familiar, but there was no soil, only an endless expanse of asphalt scarred by time and neglect. The pavement was stained with dark, iridescent pools of oil that shimmered like bruised rainbows, evidence of the machines that ruled this place. In Lancaster, the earth was a living thing that we tended with reverence, but here, the ground was dead, sealed beneath layers of tar and concrete. I took a tentative step, feeling the hardness of the surface, a brutal, unyielding reality that offered no softness for a weary traveler. It was a landscape devoid of mercy, constructed for efficiency and speed rather than life and growth, and yet, in its stark coldness, I found a strange, terrifying beauty. People flowed around me like a turbulent river, a rushing torrent of bodies that moved with a singular, hurried purpose I could not comprehend. They parted around my stationary figure not out of politeness, but out of necessity, treating me as an obstacle in their path, a stone in the stream to be navigated and forgotten. No one looked me in the eye, their gazes were fixed on invisible points in the distance or glued to the glowing screens in their hands. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of isolation, a realization that I could disappear right here, amidst thousands of souls, and not a single one of them would notice the empty space I left behind. It was a loneliness far deeper than the solitude of the fields, for it was a loneliness born of being ignored. Those few who did cast a glance in my direction did so with a sliding, indifferent curiosity that felt sticky and unclean. They took in my long, plain dress, the apron, and the prayer covering on my head with eyes that stripped me of my humanity and reduced me to a caricature. To them, I was a relic, a museum piece that had wandered out of its display case, an oddity to be briefly examined and then discarded. I saw amusement in some eyes, pity in others, but mostly, I saw a profound lack of recognition. They did not see Elizabeth. They saw Amish, a label that separated me from them as effectively as a glass wall. I tightened my grip on my bag, lifting my chin, refusing to shrink under the weight of their judgment. In my pocket, I felt the crinkle of the paper where the bishop had written the address of the Mennonite Community Center. It was meant to be my safe harbor, a place where I would be monitored, guided, and eventually returned to the path of righteousness. I pulled the paper out, staring at the scrawled handwriting that looked so fragile against the backdrop of the swirling city. It represented safety, familiarity, and the life that had been mapped out for me since birth: Jacob, the farm, the children, the silence. My feet knew they should turn toward the bus stop that would take me there, to the quiet rooms and the prayers that would wash this city dust from my soul. But my legs, seemingly possessed by a will of their own, did not move toward the designated bus stop or the waiting taxis. Instead, I crushed the piece of paper in my fist, feeling the sharp corners dig into my palm, and shoved it deep into the bottom of my pocket. I turned my back on the bright, busy avenue that led to safety and began to walk in the opposite direction. I moved away from the polished glass of the city center, seeking the cracks in the facade, drawn by an instinct I hadn't known I possessed. The further I walked, the more the city changed, stripping away its veneer of commerce to reveal the raw, beating heart beneath. I turned a corner and the atmosphere shifted instantly, the air growing heavier and thicker, charged with a different kind of electricity. I had entered a neighborhood where the buildings were no longer reaching for the sky in triumph but seemed to be crumbling under the weight of their own history. Windows were boarded up with sheets of plywood, some gray with age, others fresh and pale, like bandages over a wound. It was a place that the city planners had forgotten, a forgotten pocket of the world where the rules of the high-rises did not apply. Instead of fear, I felt a surge of recognition. This brokenness felt more honest to me than the polished lies of the downtown district. The walls here were not blank canvases of gray stone, they were alive with color, covered in bright, aggressive symbols that danced and twisted across the brickwork. Massive murals depicted faces of anger and joy, letters tangled together in a language I could not read but could feel in my gut. It was a chaotic explosion of expression, a scream of existence from people who refused to be silenced by the gray uniformity. I traced the lines of spray paint with my eyes, mesmerized by the sheer audacity of it. In my world, vanity was a sin and conformity was a virtue, but here, the very walls shouted, "I am here, and I matter." The smell of the air changed as I walked deeper into the labyrinth of streets, losing the metallic tang of the highway. It was replaced by the cloying scent of sweet, unfamiliar smoke that drifted from open windows and gathered in the stagnant alleyways. Underlying that was the smell of rotting fruit, a damp, earthy decay that reminded me of the compost heap behind the barn, but sharper and more chemically pungent. It was the scent of life lived in close quarters, of secrets and indulgences, of things fermenting in the heat. I breathed it in deeply, letting the foreign mixture fill my lungs, feeling it displace the clean, sterile air of the country. On a corner, beneath the flickering fluorescent hum of a sign that read, 24 hours, a group of young men were gathered. They were loud, their voices bouncing off the brick walls, filling the street with a boisterous energy that felt like a challenge to the encroaching night. They moved with a loose, liquid grace, their limbs swinging freely, unencumbered by the stiff formality that governed the men in my community. They laughed with their whole bodies, throwing their heads back, slapping hands, occupying the space with an arrogance that was mesmerizing. I slowed my pace, watching them from the shadows of my bonnet, fascinated by this display of uninhibited masculinity. Music was thumping from a portable speaker sitting on the sidewalk, a heavy, rhythmic bass that I could feel vibrating in my chest cavity. It was nothing like the hymns we sang on Sundays. This was primal and aggressive, a beat that demanded movement and heat. I watched the way they swayed to it unconsciously, their bodies tuned to a frequency that was alien to me. I was an intruder here, a ghost in gray drifting through their technicolor world, and by all rights, I should have been terrified. I should have crossed the street, lowered my head, and prayed for protection, but my feet remained planted on the cracked sidewalk. One of them, a tall figure who had been leaning casually against the graffiti-covered wall, suddenly pushed himself upright. He separated from the group with a slow, deliberate movement that silenced the others, his presence demanding immediate attention. He was African American, his skin dark and smooth under the harsh streetlights, and he moved with the predatory grace of a panther stalking through tall grass. He did not whistle or catcall like the boys in the market town sometimes did when we drove the buggy past. He simply watched me, his gaze intense and unwavering, tracking my approach as if he had been waiting for me all night. He stepped out into the middle of the sidewalk, effectively blocking my path, not with aggression, but with an absolute assurance that he had the right to be there. His name, I would learn later, was Marcus, but in that moment, he was nameless, a force of nature wrapped in oversized clothes. I saw the glint of a thick gold chain around his neck, catching the light like a beacon, a symbol of wealth and status that was brazenly displayed. He stood there like a king inspecting his domain, his posture relaxed but ready, radiating a confidence that made the air around him seem to crackle. I stopped a few feet away from him, my heart hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from a sudden, dizzying rush of adrenaline. Up close, his eyes were dark and bottomless, intelligent and sharp, taking in every detail of my appearance without a hint of apology. He looked at the bonnet, the dress, the shoes, and then finally, he locked his gaze with mine. There was no mockery in his expression, only a heavy, assessing weight. "You lost, pilgrim?" he asked, his voice low and vibrating, a rumble that seemed to come from the deep foundations of the city itself. The question hung in the air between us, a challenge wrapped in a nickname that highlighted just how far I was from home. He expected me to flinch, to stammer, to ask for directions back to the safety of the tourist district. He expected the terrified farm girl who had taken a wrong turn. But as I looked at him, I felt the last remnants of Elizabeth the Amish girl falling away like dry husks. The heat in my chest flared higher, burning away the caution that had been drilled into me for 18 years. I lifted my chin, meeting his stare with a boldness that surprised even me. Instead of fear, a strange fire ignited behind my eyes, a defiance that mirrored the chaotic graffiti on the walls around us. I realized in that second that I wasn't looking for safety, I was looking for exactly this, for the danger, the noise, and the raw, unfiltered life standing in front of me. "I am exactly where I wanted to be," I answered, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the thumping bass of the music. The words tasted like rebellion, sweet and intoxicating on my tongue. My answer hung there for a heartbeat, unexpected and sharp. Marcus looked at me, really looked at me, and the hard line of his mouth slowly curved upward. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was a slow, knowing grin that revealed white teeth and a dangerous charm. It was a smile that acknowledged the lie of my clothing and saw the hunger beneath it. It was a smile that promised trouble, the kind of trouble that could ruin a life or remake it entirely. And as I stood there on that dirty street corner, beneath the buzzing lights, I knew I was ready to let it happen. The staircase leading up to his apartment was narrow and steep, smelling of old pine cleaner and stale cigarette smoke, a scent that seemed to cling to the peeling wallpaper like a second skin. We climbed higher and higher, leaving the street level far below, ascending toward the roof of the city where the air felt thinner and charged with static. His apartment was located on the very top floor of an ancient brick building that must have stood since the Industrial Revolution, its bones settling with groans that echoed in the stairwell. With every step I took, the heavy black shoes I wore felt clunky and loud against the wood, announcing my foreign presence in this sanctuary of shadows. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a bird trapped in a cage, terrified yet inexplicably drawn toward the hand that reached for it. When he unlocked the door and pushed it open, the world inside assaulted me with a force that nearly made me stumble backward. The apartment was not a home in the way I understood the word, it was a lair, a command center suspended above the chaos of the streets. The space was dominated by sound, a relentless, thumping bass that did not just play in the background but seemed to live in the walls themselves. It hit me in the chest with physical blows, a deep, resonant vibration that forced my own heartbeat to stutter and realign itself to this alien tempo. In the farmhouse, silence was a revered guest, cherished and protected, but here, silence had been murdered and replaced by this electronic pulse that demanded to be felt as much as heard. I stepped inside, clutching my bag like a shield, my eyes darting around the room trying to make sense of the visual cacophony. The furniture was a mix of expensive, dark leather and cheap, discarded crates, a juxtaposition of wealth and poverty that mirrored the man who lived here. There were piles of clothes on the floor, boxes of unknown contents stacked in corners, and remnants of takeout food on the table, yet amidst the clutter, there was a strange, aggressive order. It was the den of a creature who slept with one eye open, where comfort was secondary to survival. The air was thick with heat, rising from the radiators that hissed in the corner, carrying the scent of cologne and something herbal and sweet that made my head spin with a pleasant dizziness. Marcus moved past me, tossing his keys onto a glass table with a sharp clatter that cut through the music. He didn't offer me a seat or a drink, he simply assumed his place in the center of his world. He sank into a deep, velvet armchair that looked like a throne salvaged from a ruined palace, its fabric worn smooth at the armrests. From this vantage point, he watched me. His gaze was heavy, unblinking, and entirely devoid of the polite deference I was used to receiving from the men in my community. He looked at me not as a guest, but as a puzzle he had brought home to solve, or perhaps a prize he had won at a carnival and was now deciding where to display. The contrast between us was so sharp it felt almost violent, a collision of two universes that had no business overlapping. I stood there in my long, dark dress, the apron stiff with starch, my hands hidden in my sleeves, a figure carved from the 19th century dropped into the neon glare of the modern night. He was sprawled in his chair, draped in oversized streetwear, the gold chain at his throat catching the flicker of the television screen, radiating an aura of dangerous freedom. I felt ridiculously conspicuous, a smudge of charcoal on a vibrant painting, yet I could not look away from him. He was the anchor in this storm of noise, the only solid thing in a room that felt like it was spinning. I turned away from his intense scrutiny, unable to bear the weight of it any longer, and moved toward the large window that dominated the far wall. I needed to see something other than the hunger in his eyes, something that would ground me. But the view that greeted me offered no comfort, it only emphasized how far I had fallen. The city of Philadelphia stretched out below us like a restless ocean of electric fire, a sprawling grid of amber and white lights that burned with a cold, artificial intensity. There were no stars here, the city had swallowed them, replacing the heavens with its own man-made constellations of street lamps and skyscrapers. Standing there, looking out at the endless expanse of concrete and light, I realized that the horizon had vanished. Back home, I could always see where the earth ended and the sky began, a boundary that defined my world and my place in it. Here, there were no boundaries, only an infinite sprawl of humanity living, fighting, and dying in the boxy glow of apartments stacked one atop another. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, feeling the vibration of the city humming against my palm. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sight, a visual representation of the chaos I had invited into my life. I was a speck of dust floating in a hurricane, untethered and drifting. I could feel him watching my back, his gaze a physical sensation that pricked at the skin of my neck. I didn't need to turn around to know that he had stood up, the change in the room's energy was palpable, a sudden shift in air pressure that signaled the approach of a storm. He moved across the floor with a terrifying silence, his expensive sneakers making no sound on the hardwood, a predator closing the distance to its prey. I held my breath, my muscles tensing, waiting for the inevitable contact, caught between the urge to run and the desire to stay and burn. The music seemed to swell, the bass syncing perfectly with the thudding of my blood. He stopped directly behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a furnace burning through the layers of my modest clothing. He didn't touch me immediately. He let the anticipation build, a master of suspense, letting me stew in the electric tension that crackled between us. I stared at my own reflection in the darkened glass, seeing a ghost of a girl with wide, frightened eyes, a stranger wearing my face. And behind her, a dark shadow, looming and powerful, consuming the light. I wanted him to touch me. The thought was a sin so black it should have struck me dead, but it was the only truth ringing in my mind. Then, his hands came up. They didn't grab or grope, they hovered for a second before landing softly on my shoulders. His fingers were long and strong, heavy with the weight of rings, and even through the fabric of my dress, I could feel their calloused roughness. But then his hands moved up, sliding along the column of my neck, sending shivers racing down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He found the strings of my prayer covering, the white ribbons that symbolized my submission to God, to the church, and to the man I was destined to marry. He fingered the knot slowly, teasingly, as if testing the strength of the conviction that had tied it. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. To remove the covering in the presence of a man who was not my husband, who was not even of my faith, was an act of rebellion so profound it shattered the very foundation of my upbringing. It was a shedding of my identity, a rejection of the protection of the community. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my throat, waiting for him to make the choice for me, because I was too paralyzed by desire and fear to make it myself. With a deliberate, fluid motion, he pulled the strings. The knot gave way easily, almost eagerly, as if it had been waiting for his touch to unravel. The bonnet loosened, sliding backward off my head, and for the first time in my adult life, the air of a strange room touched the back of my neck. He let the white fabric fall from his fingers, and I watched it drop in the reflection of the window. It fluttered down like a wounded dove, landing on the dirty floorboards in a heap of crumpled linen. It lay there, a discarded relic of a life that suddenly felt 1,000 miles away. But he wasn't finished. His hands returned to my head, finding the heavy pins that held my hair in its severe, tight bun. One by one, he pulled them out, dropping them onto the floor where they pinged like tiny bullets. I felt the weight of my hair shifting, the tension releasing, a physical manifestation of the walls coming down. When the last pin was removed, my hair cascaded down, a heavy, golden brown wave that reached all the way to my waist. It tumbled over my shoulders, covering me like a shawl, a secret glory that was meant only for the eyes of a spouse, now laid bare for him. He buried his hands in the mass of it, his dark fingers contrasting sharply with the pale strands. He groaned low in his throat, a sound of hunger and appreciation that made my knees weak. He gripped the hair at the base of my skull, not gently, but with a firm, possessive tightness. He pulled my head back, forcing my chin up, exposing the vulnerable line of my throat. I gasped, the sound loud in the sudden lull of the music, and was forced to look up into the reflection of his eyes in the glass, and then, as he turned me around, into the real, burning depths of them. The air between us thickened, becoming viscous and hot, charged with an erotic electricity that made it difficult to breathe. This was not the polite, respectful distance of courtship I had known. This was raw, primal, and terrifyingly real. I thought of Jacob, of his awkward, sweaty palms and his careful, chaste kisses that felt like dry leaves brushing against my cheek. Jacob touched me as if I were a fragile porcelain doll that might shatter if handled too roughly. He touched me with reverence, yes, but it was a reverence devoid of fire, a safe, tepid warmth that promised a lifetime of boredom. Marcus did not touch me like I was fragile. He touched me like I was something durable, something that could withstand the heat of his intensity. He touched me with a thirst that bordered on violence, a desperate, clawing need that promised not safety, but pleasure, sharp, blinding, and all-consuming. His grip on my hair tightened, angling my face so I couldn't look away, forcing me to acknowledge what was happening. I was not a victim here, I was a participant. I leaned back into his hold, my body betraying centuries of repression, arching toward the source of this new, dangerous heat. I stepped closer, closing the final inch of distance between us, pressing my back against his chest until there was no space left for Jesus or guilt. I could feel the hard planes of his body against my spine, the heavy buckle of his belt, the steady, driving rhythm of his heart beating against my shoulder blades. The layers of my dress, once a fortress of modesty, now felt like flimsy tissue paper, doing nothing to block the searing imprint of his form against mine. I was drowning in his scent, in the power he radiated, in the sheer, overwhelming reality of his existence. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin just below my ear, sending shockwaves of sensation rippling through my nerves. His breath was hot and moist, carrying the scent of tobacco and mint. When he whispered, his voice was a rough rasp that scraped against my soul, an invitation to ruin that sounded like the sweetest prayer I had ever heard. He didn't ask for permission, he stated his intent, his words weaving a spell that dismantled the last of my defenses. It was a temptation that bypassed my conscience and spoke directly to the blood rushing in my veins. In that moment, suspended high above the city in a room filled with bass and smoke, something inside me fractured and reformed. I wasn't just breaking a rule, I was shattering the entire tablet. I was burning the bridge that led back to the farm, to the silence, to the life of a dutiful wife. I was handing the map of my body and my destiny to this stranger, allowing his hands to redraw the borders, to claim territories that had been forbidden. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against his shoulder, and surrendered to the fall, letting the darkness rise up to meet me. The transformation did not happen in stages, nor was it a gentle evolution like the slow turning of the seasons back home. It was sudden and violent, a fever that broke in the middle of the night, revealing that the sickness had actually been the cure all along. It was as if a dormant disease, something wild and ancient that had been sleeping in my blood since birth, had finally woken up and clawed its way to the surface. I woke up one morning and the girl from the farm was simply gone, replaced by a creature who looked at the world with hungry, predatory eyes. The change was physical, visceral, and absolute, starting with the shedding of the skin that had been forced upon me by 18 years of tradition and fear. The long, heavy dresses that had defined my silhouette for my entire life were the first to go. I gathered them up in a bundle, the fabric smelling of lavender and obedience, and shoved them into a black plastic trash bag with a ruthlessness that frightened me. There was no ceremony, no moment of hesitation or sentimental farewell to the garments that had shielded me from the eyes of men. I carried the bag to the dumpster in the alley behind the building and threw it in, watching it land among the rotting food and broken glass. As the lid clanged shut, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a phantom burden of modesty that I hadn't realized was crushing my spine until it was gone. Then came the scissors. I found a pair of heavy, rusted shears in one of Marcus's kitchen drawers, the kind used for cutting poultry or thick cardboard. Standing before the cracked mirror in the bathroom, I looked at the heavy bun pinned to the back of my head, the symbol of my subjection. I unpinned it, letting the hair fall to my waist one last time, a golden curtain that had never known the bite of a blade. My hands did not shake. I took the shears and began to cut, the metal grinding against itself with a satisfying, rhythmic crunch that sounded like bones breaking. The hair fell to the linoleum floor in thick, heavy clumps, lying there like dead snakes coiled in the dust. I watched them fall, mesmerized by the irreversible nature of the act. With every slice, I severed a connection to my mother, to the church, to the expectation of a quiet life. When I was finished, I stared at the stranger in the mirror. Her hair was jagged and uneven, a rough bob that barely grazed her chin, exposing the pale, vulnerable nape of her neck. It looked dangerous and raw, a style born of necessity and defiance rather than fashion. I ran my fingers through the lightness of it, feeling the air touch my scalp, a sensation so new and shocking it made me shiver. Elizabeth was dead, buried under a pile of severed hair and discarded linen. In her place stood Liz. I took a piece of charcoal from an artist's kit I found in the closet and lined my eyes with it, drawing thick, black streaks that turned my gaze into a weapon. The darkness around my eyes made the blue of my irises pop with an unnatural intensity, making me look like a nocturnal animal caught in a flashbulb. I painted my lips with a dark stain that looked like dried blood. The face staring back at me was hard, angular, and terrifyingly beautiful. It was the face of someone who had seen the edge of the world and decided to jump off. My wardrobe changed to match my new skin. I began to wear skirts so short they would have caused a scandal in the next county, let alone my own village. They were made of denim or leather, tight bandages that restricted my stride but showcased the long, pale expanse of my legs. I wore them like a challenge, daring the world to look, daring them to judge. To cover the upper half of my body, I stole Marcus's jackets. They were oversized, swallowing my frame in billowing nylon and leather, smelling of his cologne and the streets. Wrapping myself in his clothes gave me a false sense of protection, as if his reputation was a physical armor I could zip up to my chin. Marcus took me everywhere with him. I became a fixture in his passenger seat, a permanent accessory to his life. I would sit with my knees pulled up, resting my feet in their heavy combat boots on the dashboard of his car, leaving scuff marks on the expensive vinyl. I watched the city scroll past through the windshield, viewing the streets not as a pedestrian, but as royalty observing her subjects from a carriage. I learned to look at the people on the sidewalk with a distinct mixture of boredom and disdain, a look I had practiced in the mirror until it was perfect. I was no longer the prey, I was with the apex predator, and that made me dangerous by association. I saw the way people looked at Marcus. When we pulled up to a corner or idled at a red light, heads would turn, and conversations would die. There was fear in their eyes, a sharp, instinctive respect that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of. And then their eyes would slide to me, the pale, blonde anomaly sitting beside him, looking out with kohl-rimmed eyes. I saw their confusion, their judgment, and their fear. They didn't know what to make of me, so they feared me too. I absorbed that fear like a sponge, letting it fill the empty spaces where my faith used to be. I was the white queen on the chessboard of the ghetto, a piece that didn't belong but held a unique, terrifying power. Letters from Jacob arrived at the community center with pathetic regularity. I knew they were there, piling up in a dusty pigeonhole, written on plain paper with his neat, cramped handwriting. I could imagine the words without opening them: scripture verses, updates on the harvest, polite inquiries about my spiritual well-being. The thought of them made me nauseous. I never went to collect them. They belonged to a girl who didn't exist anymore. To read them would be to acknowledge a past that felt as distant as a dream, a grayscale memory that had no place in my new, technicolor reality. I left them to rot, just as I had left his wooden bird on the floor of the bus. One afternoon, while we were cruising through the historic district, a place where tourists flocked to see the birthplace of the nation, I saw something that made my blood freeze and then boil. It was a horse and buggy, distinctively Amish, navigating the busy city traffic with agonizing slowness. The horse looked terrified, its eyes rolling, surrounded by honking taxis and aggressive drivers. The family inside sat rigid and staring straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the modern world pressing in on them. They looked like statues, petrified relics from a bygone era, clinging to a purity that was nothing more than ignorance. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, harsh and jagged. I rolled down the window and leaned out, the wind whipping my short hair across my face. I laughed loudly, a cruel, braying sound that startled the pedestrians on the sidewalk. I pointed at the buggy, mocking their fear, mocking their clothes, mocking the very life I had escaped. Look at them. I shouted over the noise of the traffic, my voice cracking with hysteria. Look at the sheep. The father driving the buggy turned his head slightly, and for a second, our eyes met. He saw a wild, painted woman screaming from a drug dealer's car. He didn't recognize me, but I recognized the pity in his eyes. I hated him for it. I laughed until my ribs ached, until the tears running down my face ruined my makeup, turning my cheeks into a black-streaked mask of tragedy. I threw myself into the education of the streets with the same fervor I had once applied to memorizing psalms. I learned the language of the corner, the slang that moved faster than the city buses. I learned how to walk so that no one would bump into me, how to hold my body in a way that said, back off. I learned that eye contact was a weapon: hold it too long and you were issuing a challenge, look away too fast and you were prey. I found the balance, a hooded, heavy-lidded stare that said I saw everything but cared about nothing. It was a performance, of course, but the best performances are the ones where the actor forgets they are on a stage. But the greatest source of my power lay hidden beneath the passenger seat. I knew it was there, wrapped in an oily rag, cold and heavy steel. A gun. Marcus never spoke of it directly to me, but I had seen him slide it under there one night when the sirens were too close. Knowing it was just inches beneath me, vibrating with the hum of the engine, gave me a rush that was almost sexual. It was the ultimate arbiter, the final word in any argument. In my old life, authority came from God and the elders. Here, authority came from 9 millimeters of lead. The proximity to that kind of lethal force made me feel invincible, like a goddess of war riding her chariot through the flames. This power was a drug, more potent than the cheap wine we drank from paper cups or the sweet smoke that filled the apartment. It buzzed in my veins, drowning out the quiet voice of conscience that sometimes tried to whisper in the dark. I was addicted to the adrenaline, to the looks of shock on people's faces, to the feeling of being entirely, recklessly free. I was no longer Elizabeth the farm girl, destined to bake bread and bear children in silence. I was Liz, the queen of the block, and I would burn this city down before I ever put a bonnet back on my head. I sat back in the seat, lit a cigarette with shaking hands, and watched the smoke curl up toward the roof of the car, feeling the glorious, terrible weight of my own corruption. The atmosphere in the neighborhood had curdled, shifting from a chaotic vibrancy to something brittle and sharp, like glass waiting to shatter. The heat that rose from the pavement seemed to carry a new weight, pressing down on the rooftops and choking the alleyways with a sense of impending doom. Marcus, usually the unshakable king of his concrete domain, had begun to fray at the edges, his confidence eroded by invisible currents of danger. He was constantly checking his phone, the screen illuminating his face with a harsh, blue ghost light that revealed the deepening lines of tension around his eyes. Every time we drove, his gaze was glued to the rearview mirror, tracking headlights with the obsession of a hunted animal, searching for the telltale silhouette of a patrol car. For me, however, this tightening noose did not bring fear, it brought a thrill so potent it tasted like copper on my tongue. I watched his paranoia with a fascination that bordered on obsession, feeling my own pulse sync with the erratic rhythm of his anxiety. In the quiet, dusty afternoons of my childhood, fear was a distant, abstract concept, the fear of a poor harvest, or the fear of God's judgment. But this was immediate, physical, and electric. The danger was a spice that made the air taste sweeter and the shadows look deeper. I was not just an observer of his world anymore, I was living inside the barrel of the gun, waiting for the trigger to be pulled, and the suspense was the most alive I had ever felt. One evening, the inevitable finally caught up with us, manifesting as a sudden eruption of chaos that tore through the humid night air. We were walking back to the car from a collection spot, moving through the labyrinth of backstreets, when the world exploded into noise. Sirens began to wail, not in the distance, but terrifyingly close, their screams bouncing off the brick walls and disorienting the senses. Blue and red lights slashed through the darkness, strobing against the graffiti and turning the street into a fractured nightmare of color and shadow. Marcus grabbed my hand, his grip crushing the small bones of my fingers, and pulled me into the gaping maw of an abandoned warehouse, the rusted metal door groaning as we slipped inside. The interior of the warehouse was a cavern of decay, smelling of wet cardboard, rat droppings, and the lingering, metallic scent of old machinery. We scrambled over piles of debris, our footsteps echoing too loudly in the vast, empty space, kicking up clouds of dust that danced in the slivers of light cutting through the boarded-up windows. The sirens were right outside now, a deafening cacophony that seemed to vibrate the very floor beneath our feet. The flashing lights swept through the cracks in the walls, illuminating Marcus's face in jagged bursts, red, then blue, then darkness. He pushed me into a dark corner, behind a stack of rotting pallets, pressing us both into the shadows as the cruisers roared past, their searchlights sweeping the street we had just vacated. The adrenaline that flooded my system was overwhelming, a chemical tidal wave that demanded an immediate, physical release. Huddled in the dark, with the danger prowling just inches away on the other side of the brick, the fear transmuted instantly into a ferocious, blinding desire. Marcus pinned me against the cold, rough surface of the wall, his body a heavy, solid weight that trapped me there. He didn't ask, he took. His mouth crashed onto mine with a desperation that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. His kiss tasted of stale tobacco, adrenaline, and the metallic tang of a split lip, a flavor that was harsh and real and utterly intoxicating. I responded with equal fervor, my hands clawing at his shoulders, digging into the leather of his jacket as if I could tear through it to the skin beneath. This was not the gentle, procreative act whispered about by the women in my community. This was a collision, a violent affirmation of life in the face of capture. Every touch was rough, every movement sharp and urgent. In this chaos, under the threat of exposure, our intimacy became an act of war against the world that wanted to separate us. We were defying the police, the law, and the very structures of society, creating a bubble of heat and friction that no badge or Bible could penetrate. He gripped my hips, his fingers digging into my flesh with enough force to leave bruises that I would wear later like badges of honor. I welcomed the pain, it grounded me, proving that this was not a dream, that I was not floating away into the ether. The friction of the brick wall scraped against my back, ruining the fabric of the expensive jacket I had stolen from him, but I didn't care. The sensory overload, the sirens wailing, the dust choking my lungs, the heat of his body, the cold of the wall, merged into a singular, blinding moment of ecstasy. It was a union sealed not by vows before a silent altar, but by the shared, ragged breath of two outlaws hiding in the dark. When it was over, the silence that rushed back into the warehouse was deafening. The sirens had faded into the distance, leaving behind only the distant hum of the city and the sound of our own heavy breathing. We stood there for a moment, untangling ourselves, the reality of our situation settling back onto our shoulders like a damp coat. Marcus stepped back, adjusting his clothes, his chest heaving as he stared at me. The wildness in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by a cold, calculating look that I hadn't seen directed at me before. He wasn't looking at me like a lover anymore, he was looking at me like a strategist evaluating a new weapon. He ran a hand over his face, wiping away the sweat, and then looked me dead in the eye, his expression serious and unyielding. "I need to move something," he said, his voice low and raspy in the gloom. "Tonight. Across the bridge." He didn't need to elaborate on what something was, the weight of the unspoken word hung heavy in the air between us. He explained the problem with clinical detachment, his car was known, his face was flagged. The police were setting up checkpoints on the bridge, looking for him, looking for the vehicle that had been spotted at the scene of the last deal. He was trapped on this side of the river, and the product was burning a hole in his pocket. He stepped closer, reaching out to touch my cheek, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a deceptive gentleness. "They won't look at you," he whispered, the words sounding like a seduction. "Not you, Liz. You look like a doll. You look like nothing." He meant it as a compliment, a testament to the lingering ghost of innocence that clung to my features despite the haircut and the makeup. To the cops, I was just a girl, maybe a little lost, maybe a little edgy, but certainly not a mule for a drug empire. I was the perfect camouflage, a Trojan horse wrapped in pale skin and blue eyes. I understood immediately what he was asking. He was offering me a choice, though he phrased it as a necessity. I could refuse. I could say it was too dangerous, that I was just a farm girl playing dress-up, and he would probably find another way, another girl. But the thought of being left behind, of being relegated back to the passenger seat while he took the risks, was unbearable. This was the test. This was the moment where the game stopped being a game and became a life. If I did this, I wasn't just his girlfriend or his mascot, I was his partner. I was necessary. I didn't hesitate. Not for a single second. The fear that should have paralyzed me was absent, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I looked at the black duffel bag sitting in the corner, the one he had been guarding with his life. It looked innocuous enough, just a piece of luggage, but I knew it contained enough felony charges to bury me in a concrete cell for the rest of my natural life. And yet, looking at it, I felt a surge of pride. I walked over to the bag and grabbed the handle. It was heavier than I expected, a dense, dead weight that pulled at my shoulder socket, but I didn't let my arms sag. I hoisted the strap onto my shoulder, feeling the bite of the nylon webbing, and turned back to face him. I saw the relief flood his eyes, followed quickly by a flash of triumph. He knew he had me. He knew that I was no longer the girl who had arrived on a bus with a Bible and a wooden bird. I stood up straighter, adjusting the oversized jacket to hide the bulge of the bag, and met his gaze. I didn't say a word, I didn't need to. I simply smiled, that slow, dangerous smile that had stopped him on the street corner that first night, the smile that promised I was capable of anything. "Give me the keys," I said, my voice steady and commanding, echoing slightly in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. I held out my hand, palm up, waiting. Marcus stared at me for a beat longer, as if seeing me for the first time all over again. Then, he reached into his pocket and dropped the keys into my hand. The metal was warm from his body. I closed my fist around them, feeling the jagged edges bite into my skin, and turned toward the door. I was ready to cross the bridge. I was ready to drive into the lights, past the men with badges and guns, and prove to everyone, to Marcus, to the cops, and to the ghost of Elizabeth, that I was the queen of this city now. The plan was simple, elegant in its terrifying efficiency, or at least that was what I told myself as I sat alone in the idling car. The engine purred beneath me, a steady vibration that traveled up through the seat and settled in my spine, a mechanical reassurance that power was still at my fingertips. The duffel bag sat heavy and ominous in the footwell of the passenger side, a black nylon beast that breathed a cold chill against my ankles. I drummed my fingernails, painted the color of dried blood, against the steering wheel, watching the digital clock on the dashboard tick away the seconds. Marcus was supposed to be here a minute ago. He had told me to wait, to keep the engine running, while he checked the perimeter one last time. I felt a surge of arrogant pride swell in my chest. I was the driver, the keeper of the keys, the one entrusted with the fortune. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, admiring the sharp lines of my kohl-rimmed eyes, telling myself that I was untouchable, a queen waiting for her king to return so we could cross the bridge and conquer the night. The silence of the street was shattered not by a sound, but by an annihilation of darkness so sudden and absolute it felt like a physical blow. The world outside the windshield, which had been a comfortable canyon of shadows and muted street lamps, was instantly incinerated by a supernova of artificial white light. It didn't come from a single source, it came from everywhere at once, front, back, and sides, blinding me with the intensity of 1,000 suns. My pupils, dilated in the gloom, contracted painfully, and I threw my hands up to shield my face, my heart hammering a frantic, broken rhythm against my ribs. For a split second, my mind refused to process the reality, clinging to the desperate hope that this was some kind of mistake, a construction accident, or a lightning strike. But deep down, in the pit of my stomach where the fear had been festering, I knew exactly what it was. Then came the voice, amplified by a megaphone until it sounded like the wrath of God descending from the heavens, metallic and distorted and terrifyingly loud. Driver. Turn off the engine. Throw the keys out the window. Exit the vehicle with your hands in the air. Now. The command echoed off the brick facades of the buildings, bouncing back and forth until the air itself seemed to be vibrating with authority. The illusion of my power evaporated instantly, leaving me shivering and small in the oversized driver's seat. I fumbled for the ignition, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip the plastic, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the crackle of police radios and the sound of heavy boots hitting the pavement. I rolled down the window, the glass sliding away to let in the cold night air, and dropped the keys. They hit the asphalt with a lonely, pathetic chime that sounded like the final bell of a funeral. I opened the door and stepped out into the blinding glare, my legs feeling like they were made of water. I squinted against the lights, tears streaming down my face from the sheer brightness, trying to make sense of the chaos surrounding me. I was surrounded. There were patrol cars positioned at every angle, forming a wall of steel and strobe lights, their red and blue flashers cutting through the white beams like strobes in a nightmare disco. Behind the open doors of the cruisers, I could see the dark silhouettes of officers, their weapons drawn and trained on my chest. I stood there in my short skirt and oversized jacket, my hands raised above my head, trembling in the wind. And even then, amidst the terror, a foolish, childish part of my brain was waiting for Marcus. I expected him to burst onto the scene, guns blazing, a cinematic hero who would sweep me away from this disaster, or at least a mastermind who would appear from the shadows with a lawyer and a loophole. But the street remained devoid of any savior. 2 officers broke from the line and rushed toward me, their movements aggressive and fast. I didn't resist, I couldn't, but they treated me as if I were a threat of the highest order. Rough hands grabbed my wrists, twisting them behind my back with a force that sent a jolt of pain shooting up to my shoulders. I felt the cold, biting metal of handcuffs snapping shut around my wrists, the sound final and irrevocable. They shoved me against the side of the car, my cheek pressed against the cold metal roof, the grit of the city scratching my skin. Clear, one of them shouted, while another dove into the car. I watched from the corner of my eye as he emerged seconds later, holding the black duffel bag aloft like a trophy hunter displaying a kill. He unzipped it with a loud rasp, and the harsh lights illuminated row after row of plastic-wrapped bricks. White powder. A mountain of it. Enough cocaine to bury a village, enough to ensure I would never see the sun as a free woman again. The weight of the realization crushed the breath out of my lungs. This wasn't just a possession charge, this was trafficking, distribution, a federal nightmare wrapped in nylon. I heard the officers whistling low, impressed by the haul, throwing around numbers, 20 years, life, no parole. They were talking about my future as if it were a mathematical equation that had already been solved. They spun me around, preparing to march me toward the waiting cruiser, and that was when the crowd caught my eye. The commotion had drawn people from the surrounding blocks, a sea of faces pressed against the yellow police tape that had materialized at the end of the street. They were spectators at a public execution, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the scene, hungry for the drama of someone else's ruin. And there, standing just behind the police barricade, calm and untouched amidst the chaos, was Marcus. Time seemed to freeze, the wailing sirens fading into a dull roar as my vision tunneled down to him. He wasn't hiding in the shadows, he was standing in the front row of the spectacle, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his jeans. He looked pristine, relaxed, as if he were watching a movie rather than the destruction of the person he had slept with hours before. But the knife twisted deeper when I saw who was with him. Draped over his arm, chewing gum with an oblivious, bovine rhythm, was another girl. She was young, Hispanic, with big hoop earrings and a tight dress, looking at the police lights with bored amusement. She was the replacement. She was the next shift. Our eyes met across the gulf of asphalt and police lines. I searched his face for anything, regret, sorrow, panic, even a flicker of guilt. I would have accepted fear, I would have forgiven him if he looked like he was suffering too. But there was nothing. His eyes were flat, dead, devoid of any emotion whatsoever. He looked at me with the same clinical detachment he used to inspect a package of product. In that split second, the horrifying architecture of his plan laid itself bare in my mind. The nervousness earlier, the constant checking of mirrors, the sudden need to use me to drive the car, it wasn't panic. It was preparation. He knew the heat was on. He knew the bust was coming. He needed a decoy, a sacrifice to throw to the wolves so the pack would stop hunting him. He hadn't just used me, he had curated me for this exact moment. The Amish girl gone bad, the innocent corrupted by the city, it was a narrative so juicy, so perfect for the headlines, that the police and the media would feast on it for weeks. I was the shiny object he was waving in their faces to distract them from the real operation. He had traded my life, my freedom, and my soul for his own immunity. I was nothing more than an expense on a balance sheet, a piece of inventory to be written off when the market got too hot. The realization didn't bring tears. It brought a white-hot, volcanic rage that started in my belly and erupted through my throat. I screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror or a plea for mercy. It was a primal, animalistic sound of pure fury, a shriek that tore at my vocal cords and silenced the officers nearest to me. Marcus. I howled, struggling against the grip of the policeman, thrashing like a wild thing caught in a trap. You bastard. You devil. The officers tightened their hold, dragging me faster toward the car, but I couldn't take my eyes off him. I wanted to claw his face off, to burn him with the fire that was consuming me. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He just watched, a faint, ghost of a smirk playing on his lips, as if my agony was the final validation of his genius. He whispered something to the girl on his arm, and they both laughed, a sound I couldn't hear but could see in the bobbing of their heads. The crowd on the sidewalk surged forward, phones raised like weapons, capturing every second of my degradation. I saw the flashes of cameras, the glowing screens recording my breakdown for the entertainment of the internet. I could hear their jeers now, cutting through the sirens. Look at the Amish girl. Check out the bonnet gone bad. That's what happens when you leave the farm. They were laughing, pointing, turning my tragedy into a meme before I had even been booked. I wasn't a person to them, I was content. I was a cautionary tale in a short skirt, a punchline to a joke I hadn't known I was telling. The humiliation was absolute, a physical substance that coated me like slime. The police officer shoved me toward the back of the cruiser, his hand pushing down on my head to clear the doorframe. I stumbled inside, the hard plastic seat unforgiving against my bruised body. The door slammed shut with a final, resonant thud that cut off the noise of the street instantly. The silence inside the car was sudden and deafening. Through the thick, wire mesh reinforced glass, I watched the scene recede. I saw the lights, the milling cops, the laughing crowd. And I saw Marcus turn his back on me. He put his arm around the new girl's waist and began to walk away, disappearing into the darkness of the city that I had thought belonged to us. I sat alone in the cage of the police car, the handcuffs biting into my wrists, the smell of stale vomit and disinfectant filling my nose. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. I thought of the wooden bird I had crushed on the bus floor. I thought of the long hair lying on Marcus's bathroom floor. I thought of Jacob and his steady, boring love. I had burned every bridge, severed every tie, and sold my birthright for a taste of freedom that was nothing more than a mirage. I wasn't a queen. I wasn't a gangster. I was just a fool in a costume, sitting in the back of a cop car, while the man who held the leash walked free to find another pet. The engine roared to life, and as the car pulled away, taking me toward a concrete box that would be my home for decades, I didn't pray. There was no one left to listen.